Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to explain arpeggios. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 6.1 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So up to this point, we've been talking a lot about scales. We talked about the major scale and the major scale modes, and then we talked about pentatonic scales. Now we're going to talk about something that's really important as well, and that's called arpeggios. And an arpeggio is when you play the notes of a chord one at a time in order. For example, what's on your screen right now is the Ionian mode, and it's in the key of G, so it's a G major scale, G Ionian mode. Out of the Ionian mode, you know that if you start on the root and build a triad, you would have a major chord or a major triad. We can play that triad as an arpeggio if we start on any of the roots and play the intervals in order. So we would start on the root, go to the third, then the fifth, then we could just repeat it. We could go root, third, fifth, root. So right there would be a G major triad arpeggio. And the difference between an arpeggio and a chord is that a chord, the intervals don't have to be in order. In arpeggio, the intervals are in order just like a scale. And a chord, you play all the notes at one time usually when you're strumming, or you could do what's called arpeggiating and pick the notes singly, but that's different. In arpeggio, you play like a scale. You play the notes one at a time in order. And also with a chord, not only do the intervals not have to be in order, but you can only have one note on each string, because when you're playing a chord, you can't get two notes to ring out on one string. But with an arpeggio, you can have multiple notes or intervals on one string. Like right here, we have a 3 and a 5 on the 5th string. You couldn't do that with a chord, because obviously with the chord, you're not playing the notes one at a time, you're just holding a chord, so to get a note to ring out, you can only play one note on each string. And we're going to talk more about arpeggios in another series when I talk about the cage system, and this would be, if we were talking about the cage system, a G major triad arpeggio in the E shape. But we'll talk about that later. So these do have designations you can give them, but like I said, all you have to do is start on any of the root notes and play the arpeggio in order. So I could start right here on this root note and go from root to 3 to 5 to root to 3, and then I could go up to 5 if I wanted. And that would be another major triad arpeggio, and it'd be a G major triad arpeggio since we're in the key of G. And that's spanning more than one octave. I could do one octave arpeggios. I could just go root, 3, 5, and that would be an arpeggio right there as well. Or I could play up and down the whole fretboard. I could start low with a low root and go up high, crossing through multiple octaves. So here's an example where I've gone root, 3, 5, root, 3, 5, root, 3, 5, root. And that's just straight out of the scale. I just started right here. And again, that would still just be a G major triad arpeggio. And arpeggios have a lot of uses. One use is you could create guitar parts with them. If you're doing that, you wouldn't have to play the notes in order. You could mix it up just like you mix up a scale when you're soloing. So you could do that. But another important part is you can use arpeggios for soloing, and I'll talk about that a little later in this lesson. And I showed all these major triad arpeggios coming out of the Ionian mode, but just like chords, you know that you can get major triads out of Ionian, Lydian, or Mixolydian. So that means that this arpeggio could have come out of any of those modes. I'm just showing an Ionian just to keep it simple, but I could have used any of the major modes. So here is the G major scale again, G Ionian. If I were to just have the roots, 3s, and 5s on the whole fretboard, it would look like this. So this would be all of my possibilities for the major triad arpeggios up and down the whole fretboard. And it wouldn't matter how I played them as long as I played the notes in order. So I could go root, 3, 5, root, 3, 5, root, 3, 5, root. I could go root 3 5, root 3 5, root 3 5, root. It doesn't matter. I could just mix it up any way I want, just as long as I played them in order, just like a scale. And like I said, when we get into the cage system, I'll show you how you can break this up and visualize these into different shapes that are straight out of the cage system, and that helps as well. But we're not diving that deep in this lesson. I'll save that for the cage system lesson. And I just showed with major triad arpeggios, but of course it works for minor. It works for any chord. So this is G Aeolian, so the relative minor. I could build minor triad arpeggios out of these, just going root, flat 3, 5 in order this time. So if I was to go root, flat 3, 5, root, flat 3, 5, root, I would end up with a minor triad arpeggio, and this is in G minor because that's where my roots are. And then it would work the same up and down the fretboard, just like I showed you with the major triads. And the two most common types of arpeggios are your triad and your seventh chords. So if we were to take this major triad arpeggio, I've just moved it to the key of C, my roots are on C, but it's still just a major triad arpeggio, root 3 5s in order. If I were to add the major sevenths in, because the major 7 chord is spelled root 3 5 7, then I would end up with a major 7 arpeggio. And this is shown in C, so it would be a C major 7 arpeggio. And then I would just play these notes in order, just like I do a scale, and I would be playing a major 7 arpeggio. Same with minor. Here's a minor triad arpeggio. I've just moved it to the key of C. If I added in the flat 7s, because you know that a minor 7 spelled root, flat 3 5, flat 7. So if I added in the flat 7s, now I have a minor 7 arpeggio. This would be a C minor 7 arpeggio. And again, it would just be up and down the whole fretboard, just all my roots, flat 3s, 5s, flat 7s. And I already should have mentioned that the minor arpeggios and the minor 7 arpeggios can come out of any of the minor modes, because you know that any of the minor modes build a minor triad, or they also build a minor 7 chord. So you could get minor triad arpeggios or minor 7 arpeggios out of any of the minor modes from the major scale. Major 7 arpeggios obviously can only come from Ionian or Lydian, because those are the only two modes out of the major scale that build major 7 chords. And then your dominant 7 arpeggio can only come out of Mixolydian, because that's the only major scale mode that builds a dominant 7 chord. So it just follows right along with chords. They basically are chords, it's just you're playing the notes in order one at a time like a scale. And then back to this minor 7 arpeggio, another way to visualize it, instead of thinking about one of the modes, it coming out of one of the modes, or just thinking about building it from scratch, you could view the minor pentatonic scale. So here's a C minor pentatonic scale, just pattern 1. The only difference between a minor pentatonic scale and a minor 7 arpeggio is that the minor pentatonic scale has the extra note of a fourth. So if you remove that perfect fourth, you would end up with a minor 7 arpeggio. So that's another way you can view or think about building minor 7 arpeggios. And here's a major 7 arpeggio in the key of C, so C major 7 arpeggio. Obviously, if you wanted to get to a dominant 7 arpeggio, you would just lower the major 7s half a step, and then you'd have a dominant 7 arpeggio, and this is shown as C7. So C7 arpeggio. And then of course you could also have minor 7 flat 5 arpeggios out of the low grade mode. Of course you could have diminished arpeggios as well, but minor 7 flat 5 is more common. So to get to that would be really easy from the minor 7 arpeggio, because you would just obviously lower the 5th half a step. That would give you a minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio, and this is shown in C, so this is a C minor 7 flat 5 arpeggio. And like I said, the triads and the sevenths are the most common and the ones you should learn first, but you can have arpeggios for any of the chord types. For example, here's a major 6 arpeggio, and it's in the key of C, so it's a C6 arpeggio. And the only difference between this and a major 7 arpeggio is that you obviously lowered the major 7th note a whole step to the major 6th, and that gave you a major 6 arpeggio. And again, you just play the notes in order, root 3 5 6, root 3 5 6 if you wanted to repeat it, and this would work up and down the fretboard. Just as long as you put those notes in order, played them one at a time, you'd have that arpeggio. Or you could have extended arpeggios like a major 9th, and there's a couple ways you could do that. One is just to do the major 7 arpeggio, root 3 5 7, and then add the 9th where it would actually be, which is an octave higher from the 2. Also, just take a major 7 arpeggio and add in the 9ths/2s. So not worry about whether it's a 9 or a 2, just add those in, and that would be a C major 9 arpeggio, what is shown on the screen. Technically this note right here is a 2, but you can consider them 9s as well, so you can use this as a C major 9 arpeggio. So that's an explanation of arpeggios and how to build them. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson where I'm going to show you how you can use arpeggios when you solo. And be sure to download the e-guide, all the diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.